And if that much medical evidence is good enough for presumption, why isn't it good enough for this? So, but the PACT Act has specific dates, doesn't it?
It does. People who get their benefits based on the PACT Act only get an effective date of August 10th of 2022. And so if you are someone who served in Thailand, for example, and your exposure to Agent Orange was not presumptive, and so you were making a direct service connection argument for diabetes or hypertension or worst case, things like lung cancer, the VA was not very hospitable in terms of dealing with those claims. They were not very receptive. They turned them down a lot. And so what happened is a lot of those claims that were pending at the time the PACT Act became effective in August of 2022.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Tony Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking veterans' disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for benefits, be sure to subscribe for the latest developments in VA disability. I'm Francis Jackson, and this is Alexandra Jackson, and we're veterans' disability attorneys at Jackson and MacNichol, where we've helped thousands of veterans to win millions of dollars in benefits. We created this podcast as a resource for veterans applying for disability benefits. But who is it for? It's actually for lots of people, friends of veterans, relatives of veterans, family members, community members, and anyone else who wants to understand how the veterans' disability benefits system works. So today, we're going to have a new podcast talking about toxic exposures. And without further ado.
Thank you. So just to start, can you explain how VA defines toxic exposure in the context of disability claims? Like, how does it recognize toxic exposure?
Well, toxic exposure, as you know, covers a whole variety of things. But the essence of it is VA recognizes that exposure to certain chemicals may cause particular medical problems at a much higher level than ordinary people not exposed to those chemicals would experience. So the VA now has an entire new process called TARA, the Toxic Exposures Review, and they actually will go through a veteran's entire military record and assess what toxic exposures there may have been, and then compare those exposures with the medical problems that the veteran is experiencing to see if any of those exposures can reasonably be linked by medical evidence to the kinds of medical problems the veteran is experiencing.
Okay. And are they doing this off just, they've got like a list somewhere, or are they actually looking into each condition?
They do have a list somewhere that dictates what they'll look at, but with the passage of the PACT Act, which became effective in August of 2022, they now recognize a broader range of toxic exposures. So for, just as examples, for people deployed in the Middle East, they have a presumption that there is a toxic exposure that can lead to chronic respiratory problems, things like asthma and allergies, rhinitis they call it. And for folks who were in Vietnam, they've expanded the presumptions regarding exposure to Agent Orange, to include not only the veterans who were physically on the landmass in Vietnam and those in the blue waters off Vietnam within the coastal strip, but also to include those who were stationed in Thailand or were involved in incursions into Cambodia and Laos.
Are there other types? So we've mentioned Agent Orange, and then a lot of the what they kind of call Gulf War stuff starting in the 90s going up till now. They've got burn pits, for example. What other type of toxic exposures are there presumptives for that you can benefit from?
Well, there really aren't a lot of other presumptives, but what the VA has done is to become more sensitive, if you will, that's probably the best way I can describe it, to the results of toxic exposures. So, for example, for many years, we had a hard time getting benefits for people who suffered from problems from exposure to jet fuel. Jet fuel has some really bad stuff in it if you ever want to look into that.
No, I had that case already. Yep.
Yeah, and it can cause serious results, including dementia.
And neuropathy in all body parts.
Yeah, bad stuff. But I think it is fair to say that with the PACT Act, the VA has become much more concerned or focused on toxic exposures, concerned about or focused on toxic exposures, such that not only are they doing these terror memos looking at what exposures you had and how those may correlate to current medical problems, but they're also much more focused in terms of their C&P exams, compensation and pension exams, with looking at how a particular exposure may match up to a particular medical problem now. You know, years ago, when I first started practicing veterans law in the early 1990s, we had my first jet fuel exposure case, and it took over a decade because the VA just did not, or was not willing really to recognize that kind of exposure created the problems that it does. But I think it's fair to say that the VA has gotten much more realistic about acknowledging the effects of toxic exposure.
And this one's a little off, but there's also things like radiation that people can be exposed to, right?
Yeah, and the PACT Act, of course, covers that. But the thing is, while radiation exposure is a terrible thing for the human body and can do bad things, most of the folks who were exposed to radiation either at Hiroshima and Nagasaki or in the Pacific Islands testing in the early 50s, frankly, are dead now. And so there just aren't a lot of those cases that are actively being pursued within the VA system. But
Right, but the toxic exposure kind of category is
includes
a little
includes
broader
that.
than,
It is. There's no
just
question about
chemicals
that.
necessarily. They've been willing to admit to a kind of broad spectrum, I guess I'd say, of
That is true.
exposures.
That is true.
They're certainly toxic to the body, but they're not necessarily all chemical in the way we think about it.
That is true.
What are some of the most common health conditions linked to toxic exposures for veterans? What should
Well,
folks be looking out for, basically?
in my experience, folks who served in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and were exposed to the burn pits, most of the cases that we see from that are respiratory problems. There are a whole variety of respiratory problems, but they're almost all respiratory.
I've seen some fatigue and skin ones too.
Yep. There is the whole undiagnosed illness syndrome from the Middle East exposure with a whole variety of different symptoms. But those cases seem to be relatively uncommon to get to our level of needing an attorney and needing to be pursued extensively. But the things that I think we're seeing most commonly are diabetes and hypertension and a variety of cancers from the Vietnam exposure or Agent Orange. And one of the things that I think the PACT Act has really underlined is that You didn't have to be in Vietnam or Thailand to get exposed to Agent Orange. There are stateside places. There are other places like Guam, for example, where there was a lot of Agent Orange exposure. But going back to your question about exposures, my sense is that the ones that are most common are the Vietnam exposures with particularly diabetes. It just seems widespread, and hypertension, again, widespread. Several of the cancers, and then the Middle East with respiratory and other problems.
The high blood pressure one, the hypertension, it took them a pretty long while to add that as a presumptive, didn't it?
It did, and the reason for that won't surprise anybody, is all about the money. The problem is that even though hypertension clearly is significantly more likely in people exposed to Agent Orange, even without Agent Orange exposure, there is a high level of hypertension among older men. And so the cost of making hypertension presumptive for all on the ground, in the blue water, in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos veterans was potentially quite steep, and the Trump administration simply wasn't willing to do it. It took until President Biden came in for them to actually say that, yeah, we care about our veterans, we're going to support our veterans, and we're going to put this through. As you know, that's when the PACT Act passed as well.
Yeah.
But, you know, it was just all about the money. They would not add hypertension because of the cost until Biden came in.
And has that created issues with effective dates for folks? I remember I had a high blood pressure case well before they had a presumption for it. And so I was sitting there with the medical evidence arguing the same level of medical evidence from the studies from the same place that gave us the presumptives for diabetes, etc., says that, high blood pressure's same risk, so it should be presumptive. And if that much medical evidence is good enough for presumption, why isn't it good enough for this? So, but the
Yeah.
PACT Act has specific dates, doesn't it?
It does. People who get their benefits based on the PACT Act only get an effective date of August 10th of 2022. And so if you are someone who served in Thailand, for example, and your exposure to Agent Orange was not presumptive, and so you were making a direct service connection argument for diabetes or hypertension or worst case, things like lung cancer, the VA was not very hospitable in terms of dealing with those claims. They were not very receptive. They turned them down a lot. And so what happened is a lot of those claims that were pending at the time the PACT Act became effective in August of 2022, those folks got granted, but only based on the effective date of the PACT Act in 2022, even if they had claims pending back to 2016 or 2014 or 2012 or whatever.
So even though VA has admitted that it's presumptive now, you still have to argue about the effective date.
Yes, there are the bulk of those cases that are still in the system are arguments about effective date, and that the general rule about effective dates, which is that ordinarily the claim will be effective at least as of the date of filing of the claim, and sometimes earlier if you filed an intent to file form or something, then that's what those cases are still being disputed about, is whether you can push the effective date back from August of 22 under the PACT Act back to when the claim was filed in 2017 or 16 or 15 or 14 or whatever it was.
It seems like the fair thing to do if the VA has admitted that it's connected would be to just give it to them.
I certainly agree with that, and that's part of the argument that we're making in every case. But the VA is taking a pretty hard line on those cases, saying that we won't consider the presumption earlier than the effective date of the PACT Act in August of 2022. And if you want an earlier effective date, you have to prove to us, independent of the PACT Act, that you were entitled to those benefits. And, I think we'll ultimately win most of those cases, but it's unfortunate that it's going to drag on for years for some cases, for some of the veterans.
So I mean, that gets us onto kind of a related thing. These toxic exposures, some of them have the presumptions, but if they don't have a presumption, what do they have to have for evidence? I mean, that's got to take some sort of expert, right?
Often, yes. One of the big problems there, not the only big problem, but one of the big problems is that most of the folks that the VA has doing compensation and pension exams to determine whether there's a medical linkage between a current medical condition and exposures in service are not specialists in exposure cases. They're typically general practice doctors or sometimes people in other specialties. You know, you could be an orthopedic doctor or a pediatric specialist. You know, that
And they're
happens.
still giving you stuff outside your wheelhouse.
Yeah, and they're making decisions outside their area of specialty. And so it becomes very important in those cases where the VA compensation and pension exam is unfavorable to get an expert opinion explaining why, within the expertise for that particular area, whether it's respiratory or oncology or whatever it is, why this exposure, as probably as not, caused the current problem.
So, how detailed of a service history do you have to have when you're filing a claim for something related to exposure?
Well, you know, it doesn't have to be very detailed at all, as long as you can show that you were at a place and time where these exposures occurred. And sometimes that's very difficult, but it's gotten better. For a long time, the VA was categorically rejecting Agent Orange exposure cases other than in Vietnam. They just wouldn't grant them, period. But over the last 5 years in particular, maybe 7, there has been enough expert opinion to chip away at that. The VA has been forced to recognize that there have been significant Agent Orange exposures in other areas, whether you're talking about Guam, whether you're talking about Camp Drum in New York, or whether you're talking some of the Superfund sites on closed military bases. So it's moving forward. It's still not great, but it's moving forward.
Can you kind of talk about what advice you would give to vets if they're not sure that what they have is related to toxic exposure? I mean, how do you even figure out that you have something that's statistically weird, right? Like, how do
Yeah.
you go, oh, this is unusual for the rest of my factors if a doctor doesn't just say it to your face?
Well, this is overly simplistic, but you Google it. I mean, that's the real answer.
Yep.
You know, I mean, the reality is that the internet now is an enormous repository of information. The worst that's going to happen is that you get information that's not accurate that suggests that you have exposure that may not be valid. So the internet, if anything, will be over-inclusive
Okay.
rather than
So
under-inclusive. So if you
you might get a false positive, but you're not likely to get a negative.
That's right.
That's wrong.
So if you have a particular condition and you know you were stationed at, say, Fort Holabird in Maryland, where they did a lot of chemical testing, you can look on the internet and probably within 10 minutes know whether the condition that you have is one that there is some medical evidence out there suggesting may be related to chemicals that were being used at Fort Holabird widely enough that you could be exposed to it. So it's a case by case. I mean, there are at least 50 different bases in the US where there are various chemical exposures of different kinds. And so it's just, you have to look at where you were, you have to look at what you've got, you have to look at what the chemicals were there. But you literally can go on Google and at least get a preliminary indication. And once you have that, if there's nothing on Google saying that there's any correlation between what you have and exposures and where you were, odds are there really isn't. There's been so much effort spent in looking at these things now that it would really come as a surprise to me if you came up with an exposure theory that is factually supported, that hasn't been voiced by someone somewhere on the internet yet. But the real issue is once you get to that point, there's a possibility, then you have to get serious and get an expert and figure out whether what you've got really is likely to have been resulting from that exposure.
So, is there anything different about the process of filing a VA claim if you think it's based on toxic exposure?
Well, it really subdivides. If it's a presumptive condition, then that's much simpler. All you have to do really is to show that you were in the right place at the wrong time, or more accurately, in the wrong place at the wrong time. But all you have to do is to show that you were exposed and you have the condition. The presumption is going to make that link for you. You don't have to go out and get medical evidence to do it. But if it's not a presumptive condition, in that case, what you have to do is you have to prove those elements. Remember, the elements of service connection are always the same. There are only three. You have to show that something happened in the service. In this case, we're talking about an exposure in the service. You have to show that there's a current medical condition, whether it's diabetes or lung cancer or hypertension or whatever it may be. And you have to show medically that those two are connected. And so in the absence of a presumption, you've got to get out there and get the medical evidence that connects those. And so one of the biggest challenges that most veterans have is getting the expert evidence to make that connection. I would estimate that easily 90% of the cases that come to us are cases where the veteran has an incident or exposure or whatever it may be in the service and has the current condition, but hasn't been able to get a viable medical opinion linking those two.
Is that something that vets can do on their own, getting a medical opinion? I see all these companies out there about, we'll get you the medical opinion, et cetera, et cetera. But how does somebody actually suss out whether that's a good deal?
Well, that's a challenge. The reality is that there are some really good experts out there who can put this stuff together for people, and there are a bunch of scammers out there who are just taking people's money. But
Our experts normally just, charge for the report, right? So they're not going to ask for like your ongoing benefits or anything else like that.
Now, if anybody proposes to you that you should do something with your VA claim that's going to result in them being paid out of your ongoing benefits for the rest of your life, you should not walk to the nearest exit, but run. That's truly unethical scamming stuff. But
Accredited agents and attorneys can't do that, right?
that's correct. Accredited agents and attorneys only get paid from past due benefits. But in terms of getting the information, veterans really have a couple of choices. Sometimes the veteran is fortunate enough that the doctor they're treating with is expert in that area and is willing to make a statement about explaining how these things are connected. Unfortunately, that's a pretty low percentage. Failing that, then you can go to a company that offers medical opinions directly. That, unfortunately, is a very mixed bag right now. There are lots of companies out there that just are not ethical. There are some that are really good.
So basically, if it's not a one-time flat fee, and if you don't get to see the credentials, and if they can guarantee you a result, you probably shouldn't be looking at them.
Yeah, you should. Anybody who guarantees the result, you should be worried about. There's nothing guaranteed anywhere in the VA system. But the third possibility is you go to an accredited agent or representative or attorney who has done this stuff and knows who the real experts are and can arrange for an evaluation. Most of the time.
Still not guaranteed, though. Our docs turn us down all the time.
That's true, not guaranteed. But most of the time, our docs don't turn us down all the time. They turn us down occasionally. But, it's mostly about having done this for a long time and knowing what kind of fact pattern actually is likely to lead to a true exposure and a favorable opinion, and also knowing who the true experts are in the area who can make those connections. And so my advice to people, if you have a complicated exposure case and haven't been able to win it on the initial determination on your own, you should get help. It doesn't really, I don't want to be in the position of saying you have to get an attorney. You don't. But an experienced attorney or even an experienced agent, non-attorney, but somebody with serious experience in the exposure realm who knows who the experts are is where you need to go in those circumstances. And with that, I understand we're running out of time, so thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe to our podcast. We really want to spread this information as widely as possible for veterans, and we hope to see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.